You and I live in a polarized black and white world. A world where people are either good or bad, friend or foe, saint or sinner, patriot or terrorist, conservative or liberal, gay or straight, male or female, them or us. It just seems to be easier if we can keep people and ideologies in separate containers. It makes for neater categories. It's our own way of making sense of a world that more times than not makes no sense at all. Once we begin to blur the boundaries, though, people get nervous. Within our own community, even those who may be vocal advocates of same-sex marriage and gay and lesbian civil rights don't quite know what to do with the in-between categories of bisexual and transgender. Unfortunately, the solution for far too many of us is to distance ourselves and from the ideas of people we don't understand, which only serves to exacerbate the problem. In this morning's parable found in the 13th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, as well as the 57th saying of the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus describes how the blurry boundaries of God's realm are different from the them versus us categories within our own world. It's a parable which doesn't quite leave us with the warm and fuzzy feelings we prefer, but then it's not meant to. But before going into the parable's meaning, a brief botany lesson might be helpful in understanding it. The word tare in the parable comes from the Greek word zizania, which most likely refers to darnel or cockle, a weed that closely resembles wheat. Darnel is a poisonous weed, and it's hard to distinguish from wheat. In fact, the difference between the two is evident only when the plants mature and the ears appear. The ears of the real wheat are heavy and will droop, while the ears of the darnel stand up straight. And it's impossible to separate the darnel from the wheat because the roots of the two plants are so intertwined that to pull the one would uproot the other. In Matthew's interpretation of this parable, he subscribes to a polarized worldview in which good and righteous people will be rewarded and bad people will be punished in his trademark furnace of fire where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Matthew, more than any of the other gospel writers, seems to have a particular fondness for this sort of frightening imagery. But if we can manage to pull ourselves away from the horrific scene of judgment and retribution, which seems to provide so much sermon fodder for our evangelical sisters and brothers, we may find the parable has some redemptive value after all. You see, I think Jesus is trying to describe an existence, a way of living which goes by different names. Some call it the kingdom of heaven, or nirvana, or the realm of God, or enlightenment. But whatever term we use to identify it, we all seem to agree that this spiritual way of life has different rules than the rules to which we are accustomed. Rules which often seem unfair because they stem from grace rather than justice. In this way of life, people are not categorized. In this spiritual realm, we are all interconnected, sharing the same field, living side by side. Our lives are intertwined and not so easily distinguished from each other as we would like to imagine. But we forget that fact, or we try to ignore it, and before you know it, we're doing our dead level best to impose the rules which we are familiar with upon this strange and wonderful upside-down world of gods. We join with the workers in this morning's parable who ask the householder for permission to get rid of all the thems so the us's can live in peace. But the answer we receive is no. We are told not only to leave them alone, but to learn to live with them. And I think there are several reasons that this should be the case. First of all, as I have already said, we are interconnected. Our roots are intertwined, and we cannot uproot one without doing damage to others. It's a lesson that all of us have seen played out within churches that learned the hard way. You know what I'm talking about. It may start out with the people who prefer a contemporary worship service over a traditional one. Or people who feel the church is starting to get way too political. Or the people who really wish the pastor wouldn't talk about nirvana and enlightenment from a Christian pulpit. And before you know it, the church has divided itself into thems and us's, taking down more casualties than the U.S. Civil War. Feelings are hurt, friendships are destroyed, faith is shaken, and members walk away. No one wins when we feel compelled to root out the imagined subversive evil that lurks within our community. No one wins, but everyone suffers. Because whether you like it or not, whether you care to admit it or not, we are all connected, and we are less than whole without the sum total of everyone. Another reason I think we are called to live together instead of rooting out who we consider to be the impurities of God's dominion is so we can learn how to move past our fears. We are called to a way of life that is characterized by love, not fear. The first epistle of John, chapter 4, says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not reached perfection in love." We live our lives out in fear of the other. We distance ourselves from other religions, sure in our belief that God prefers the Christian faith over any other religion. We forget the discussion Jesus had with a Samaritan woman about the true and proper way to worship. A discussion in which the woman asked which religion was the right one, hers or his. And Jesus said, neither one was. He said, God is spirit, and those who worship God must worship in spirit and truth. We protect ourselves from the world with our locks and bolts, our guns and weapons, sure that everyone else wants what we have, certain that the world is a dangerous place in which to live, one in which we must always be on the alert for the enemy who seeks to do us harm. But if we can find within ourselves the courage to look our neighbors in the eye and discover that they are no more dangerous than we are, if we can manage to live with them instead of against them, we have a chance of moving past our fears. Fear is no way to live, and it's certainly not how God intends for us to live. When we learn to live with the thems in the world, instead of uprooting them, we usually discover that our fears were unfounded. confounded. Another reason for learning to live with them is because, quite frankly, we don't have enough sense to know who is tare and who is wheat. For many Christians, the LGBT community represents the tares in this morning's parable. For you and me, we might consider the conservative religious fundamentalists to be the tares. Isn't it funny how we always think it's someone else who is a tare, not ourselves? But God is the only one who knows who are tares and who are wheat. And in God's realm, it doesn't matter, because there is value in each and every person. And although there are probably plenty more reasons for learning to live and let live with the tares in our world, the final one I will mention today is so we can get on with the business to which we have been called. We can become so distracted about the roles of others within God's realm that we lose sight of our own calling. In the final verses of John's Gospel, there's a story in which the resurrected Christ appears to Peter, commanding him 3 times to feed the sheep of Christ and to follow him. And then it says, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. And when Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about him? Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. Like Peter, we concern ourselves about everyone else and lose our focus. If we are wheat, then our job is to grow and to bear fruit. It's not to fret over who we consider to be the tares of God's realm. If we call ourselves followers of the way of Christ, then our job is to follow him. It's not to worry ourselves about how others are following or not following. We have been called to grow side by side with the people we sometimes think of as the other. May we do so, and in so doing discover that there is no them or us in God's realm. There is only we. Amen.